Lindsay Parks, and I'm a teacher at West High School. Today we are going to look at our KCS at Home Summer Edition, 9th grade World War II module. We are going to look at our essential question of when or is it ever appropriate to use a weapon of mass destruction. The standard we're looking at is 52, describe the development of atomic bombs and evaluate both the decision to use them and the impact of their use. So we will be looking at the Manhattan Project, evaluating President Truman's decision to use it, and then looking at the impact of the bomb. If you need to adjust your video at any time, you can use these tools, which is like the closed caption or the slow down the speed, and that will help with that. The first thing that we're going to look at is just kind of a refresh of our brain of what was going on in World War II. This is a crash course video that we're going to watch. And as you watch it, you can use these guided questions to think about what you remember about World War II.
Right, so you've probably heard a lot about World War II from movies and books, the History Channel before it decided that swamp people were history, the incessant droning of your grandparents, etc. We're not going to try to give you a detailed synopsis of the war today. Instead, we're going to try to give a bit of perspective on how the most destructive war in human history happened and why it still matters globally. So one of the reasons history classes tend to be really into wars is that they're easy to put on tests. They start on one day and they end on another day, and they're caused by social, political, and economic conditions that can be examined in a multiple choice kind of manner, except not really. Like, when did World War II start? In September 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland? I'd say no. It actually started when Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, or at the very latest, when the Japanese invaded China in 1937, because they didn't stop fighting until 1945. Then again, you could also argue 1933, when Hitler took power, or 1941, when America started fighting. It's complicated. But anyway, in China, the fighting was very brutal, as exemplified by the infamous rape of Nanking, which featured the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of Chinese people, and is still so controversial today that, one, it affects relations between Japan and China, and two, even though I have not described it in detail, you can rest assured that there will be angry comments about my use of the word slaughter. But the World War II we know the most about from movies and TV is primarily the war in the European theater, the one that Adolf Hitler started. Hitler is the rare individual who really did make history. Specifically, he made it worse. And if he hadn't existed, it's very unlikely that World War II would have ever happened. But he did exist. And after coming to power in 1933 with the standard revolutionary promises to return the homeland to its former glory, infused with quite a bit of paranoia and anti-Semitism, Germany saw rapid remilitarization and eventually, inevitably, war. In the beginning, it was characterized by a new style of combat made possible by the mechanized technology of tanks, airplanes, and especially trucks. This was the Blitzkrieg, a devastating tactic combining quick movement of troops, tanks, and massive use of air power to support infantry movements. And in the very early years of the war, it was extremely effective. The Nazis were able to roll over Poland, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, and then all of France, all within about 9 months between the fall of 1939 and the summer of 1940. So after knocking out most of Central Europe, the Nazis set their sights on Great Britain, but they didn't invade the island, choosing instead to attack it with massive airstrikes. I mean, you look at this poster and think, man, the Queen wants me to finish my term paper so I can do it. But when this poster was first produced in 1939, it was to quell terror in the face of bombardment. The Battle of Britain was a duel between the Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe, and while the RAF denied the Nazis total control of British airspace, the Nazis were still able to bomb Great Britain over and over again in what's known as the Blitz. Stan, no jokes this time. Yes, the Blitz. Meanwhile, Europeans were also fighting each other in North Africa. The Desert Campaign started in 1940 and lasted through 1942. This is where British General Monty Montgomery outfoxed Erwin the Desert Fox Rommel. It's also the place where Americans first fought Nazis in large numbers, but most importantly, it's where Indiana Jones discovered the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, let's go to the thought bubble. 1941 was a big year for World War II. First, the Nazis invaded Russia, breaking a non-aggression pact that the two powers had signed in 1939. This hugely escalated the war and also made allies of the most powerful capitalist countries and the most powerful communist one an alliance that would stand the test of time and never end until like 3 seconds after the defeat of the Nazis. The Nazi invasion of Russia opened the war up on the so-called Eastern Front, although if you were Russian, it was the Western Front, and it led to millions of deaths, mostly Russian. Also, 1941 saw a day that would live in infamy when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, hoping that such an audacious attack would frighten the United States into staying neutral, which was a pretty stupid gamble because, one, the U.S. was already giving massive aid to the Allies and was hardly neutral, and two, the United States is not exactly famed for its pacifism or political neutrality. 1941 also saw Japan invading much of Southeast Asia, which made Australia and New Zealand understandably nervous. As part of the British Commonwealth, they were already involved in the war, but now they could fight the Japanese closer to home. And shut up about how I never talk about you Australians. I just gave you 1.5 sentences. But by the time the Americans and Australians started fighting the Japanese, it was already a world war. Sometimes this meant fighting or starving or being bombed. Other times it meant production for the war. You don't think of Argentina as being a World War II powerhouse, for instance, but they were vital to the Allies, supplying 40% of British meat during World War II. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So not to sound jingoistic, but the entry of the US into the war really did change everything, although I doubt the Nazis could have taken Russia regardless. No one conquers Russia in the wintertime, unless you are, wait for it, the Mongols. Okay, we're going to skip most of the big battles of 1942, like the Battle of Midway, which effectively ended Japan's chance of winning the war, and focus on the Battle of Stalingrad. The German attack on Stalingrad, now known as Volgograd because Stalin sucks, was one of the bloodiest battles in the history of war, with more than 2 million dead. The Germans began by dropping more than 1,000 tons of bombs on Stalingrad, and then the Russians responded by hugging the Germans, staying as close to their front lines as possible so that German air support would kill Germans and Russians alike. This kind of worked, although the Germans still took most of the city, but then a Soviet counterattack left the 6th Army of the Nazis completely cut off. And after that, due partly to Hitler's overreaching megalomania and partly to lots of people being scared of him, the 6th Army slowly froze and starved to death before finally surrendering. And of the 91,000 Axis POWs from Stalingrad, only about 6,000 ever returned home. Stalingrad turned the war in Europe, and by 1944, the American strategy of island hopping in the Pacific was taking GIs closer and closer to Japan. Rome was liberated in June by Americans and Canadians, and the successful British, Canadian, and American D-Day invasion of Normandy was the beginning of the end for the Nazis. Oh, it's time for the open letter? An open letter to Canada. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, it's Canadian mittens! I want to thank the Canadian Crash Course fans who sent us these mittens. Canadians are just so nice, Stan. Like, all we ever do on this show is make fun of them, and they're just like, it's so kind of you to mention us. Here's some mittens! Dear Canada, we're not always nice to you here on Crash Course, but you are awesome. I'm pointing, but you can't tell because I'm wearing mittens. 45,000 Canadians died fighting for the Allies in World War II, which means that per capita, Canada lost more people than the United States. You fought with the Royal Air Force to defend Great Britain from the beginning of the war, and you were there on D-Day successfully invading Juno Beach, and as many of you have pointed out in comments, you defeated the United States in the War of 1812, meaning that arguably, Canada, you are the greater military power. Plus, you have lumberjacks and excellent beer and hockey and universal healthcare and Justin Bieber. I'm jealous. That's what it is. I'm jealous. Best wishes, John Green. So by the end of 1944, the Allies were advancing from the west, and the Russian Red Army was advancing from the east, and then the last-ditch German offensive at the Battle of the Bulge in the winter of 1944 and 1945 failed. Mussolini was executed in April of 1945. Hitler committed suicide at the end of that month, and on May 8, 1945, the Allies declared victory in Europe after Germany surrendered unconditionally. 3 months later, the United States dropped the only 2 nuclear weapons ever deployed in war. Japan surrendered, and World War II was over. The war had a definite cause: unbridled military expansion by Germany, Japan, and to a small extent Italy. Now, it's easy to claim that Hitler was crazy or evil, and in fact he was certainly both, but that doesn't explain the Nazis' decision to invade Russia, and it sure doesn't explain Japan's decision to bomb Pearl Harbor. And there are many possible explanations beyond mere evil, but the most interesting one to me involves food. Hitler had a number of reasons for wanting to expand Germany's territory, but he often talked about Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people. German agriculture was really inefficiently organized into lots of small farms, and that meant that Germany needed a lot of land in order to be self-sufficient in food production. The plan was to take Poland, the Ukraine, and Eastern Russia and then resettle that land with lots of Germans so that it could feed German people. This was called the Hunger Plan because the plan called for 20 million people to starve to death. Many would be the Poles, Ukrainians, and Russians who'd previously lived on the land. The rest would be Europe's Jews, who would be worked to death. 6 million Jews were killed by the Nazis, many by starvation, but many through a chillingly planned effort of extermination in death camps. These death camps can be distinguished from concentration camps or labor camps in that their primary purpose was extermination of Jews, Roma people, communists, homosexuals, disabled people, and others that the Nazis deemed unfit. Some historians believe that the Nazis opened the death camps because the Jews weren't dying as fast as the hunger plan had intended. This was a sickening plan, but it made a kind of demented sense. Rather than becoming more involved in global trade as the British had, the Germans would feed themselves by taking land and killing the people who'd previously lived there. Similarly, Japan at the beginning of the war was suffering from an acute fear of food shortage because its agricultural sector was having trouble keeping up with population growth. And the Japanese too sought to expand their agricultural holdings by, for instance, resettling farmers in Korea. So while it's tempting to say that World War II was about the Allies fighting for democratic ideals against the totalitarian militaristic imperialism of the fascist Axis powers, it just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. For instance, a hugely important Allied power, Stalin's Soviet Union, was like the least democratic place ever. Sandra said that was hyperbole, but it's not. Stalin's Soviet Union is tied with all of the other completely undemocratic countries for last place on the democracy scale. It's a big community there at last place, but they're definitely in there somewhere. And by far the biggest imperialists of the war were the British. They couldn't have fed or clothed themselves or resisted the Nazis without their colonies and commonwealth. So why is World War II so important? Well, first, it proved the old Roman adage, homo homini lupus. Man is a wolf to man. This is seen most clearly in the Holocaust, but all the statistics are staggering. More than 1 million Indian British subjects died, mainly due to famine that could have been avoided if the British had redistributed food, and their failure to do so helped convince Indians that the so-called superior civilization of the British was a sham. More than 1 million Vietnamese died, mainly due to famine. 418,000 Americans, more than 1 million non-combatants in both Germany and Japan, and 20 million people in the Soviet Union, most of them civilians. These civilians were targeted because they helped sustain the war, mostly through industrial and agricultural production. In a total war, when a nation is at war, not just its army, there's no such thing as a non-military target. From the firebombing of Dresden to Tokyo to Hiroshima, the line between soldier and civilian blurred. And then, of course, there is the Holocaust, which horrifies us because the elements of Western progress, record-keeping, industrial production, technology, were used to slaughter millions. World War II saw modern industrial nations, which represented the best of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, descend into once unimaginable cruelty. And what makes World War II such a historical watershed is that in its wake, all of us, in the West or otherwise, were forced to question whether Western dominance of this planet could or should be considered progress.
And kind of just thinking through those guided questions and refreshing our brain of all the things that we talked about with World War II, the important dictators, how the U.S. gets involved, so the U.S. and Japan's relationship. The Holocaust obviously is majorly important. The next slide is going to also talk to you about some other background information. This is a slide for you more so if you just kind of need to dig a little bit deeper before we get into our atomic bomb lesson. If you do know about that, then you can go ahead and skip this slide and keep going. But like I said, those are great resources to kind of just introduce before you get into the actual document-based questions. So the next thing we're going to look at is step 2. And in this step, we are going to start with our document-based questions. So all of this document-based questions, these texts and questions, excuse me, are coming from Reading Like a Historian. And that's a great resource for you too. So for these directions, the first directions, you're going to read the 2 historical narratives and answer the guided questions. So the guided questions are in 1 to 2 sentences each. Explain the 2 narratives or stories about Hiroshima, and which narrative do you agree with more and why. So I have that for you on the next slide, the 2 historical narratives. They're also, if you're on the Word document, they're also on that Word document. So I'm going to go through those just really briefly. And then we'll kind of keep moving on. So it says source, excerpts from Three Narratives of Our Humanity by John W. Dower, 1996. The following is from a book written by a historian about how people remember wars. John W. Dower explains the two different ways that the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is remembered. So the first one is victimization. So it says Japanese still recall the war experience primarily in terms of their own victimization. For them, World War II calls to mind the deaths of family and acquaintances on distant battlefields, and more vividly, the prolonged systematic bombings of their cities. It is argued that the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima was necessary to shock the Japanese to surrender. How does one justify the hasty bombing of Nagasaki only 3 days later, before the Japanese had time to investigate Hiroshima and formulate a response? Okay, the next one is Hiroshima's triumph. So to most Americans, Hiroshima, the shattered, atomized, eradicated city, remains largely a symbol of triumph, marking the end of a horrendous global conflict and the effective demonstration of a weapon that has prevented another world war. It is hard to imagine that the Japanese would have surrendered without the atomic bomb. Japanese battle plans that were in place when the bombs were dropped called for a massive suicidal defense of the home islands, in which the imperial government would mobilize not only several million fighting men, but also millions of ordinary citizens who had been trained and indoctrinated to resist the end with primitive makeshift weapons. For Japanese to even discuss capitalization or surrender was seditious or against the law. So your guided questions you're looking at are, in 1 to 2 sentences, explain the two narratives or stories about the bombings, and then which narrative do you agree with more and why? So think about why you agree with that one more, because that's kind of where our document-based questions are going to continue going. Your next slide, for those of you who don't know a lot about that, about the actual bombings, you have a map that you can look at, and then you also have this history.com article. Throughout this article, there's information that you can read, but there's also a few videos that you can watch on the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki if you would like to know more about the actual days and the actual events of that. We're going to go ahead and continue to the next slide, which is step 4. And in this step, we're going to look at a close reading strategy. So again, all of these readings and documents and document-based questions are taken from Reading Like a Historian. And we are going to look at kind of just creating, getting our brain wrapped around the why this happened and the like, what do we think about that? So we're going to use documents A through E, which are listed in this PowerPoint, but also on your Word document. And as we're looking at those, we're going to complete our graphic organizers. And like I said, we're going to do a close reading. So a close reading strategy is something where we are going to read through the text a few different times. I'm going to model the first one so that you are kind of understanding what we're looking for, and then we'll go from there. So I'm going to kind of try and screen share here just for a second. Let's see. Okay, so we are looking at document A. So on your Word document, or if you want to just go to the next slide on the PowerPoint, you can see it there as well. But so our close reading strategy, the first time we're going to read this, we're going to read to read it. So we've never read this text before, so we're going to go ahead and read through it so that we can become familiar with the text. And I'm going to model for you just this document A, and then you can do the other ones on your own. So it says textbook. Even before the bomb was tested, American officials began to debate how to use it. Admiral William Leahy, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, opposed using the bomb because it killed civilians indiscriminately. He believed that an economic blockade and conventional bombing would convince Japan to surrender. Secretary of War Henry Stimson wanted to warn the Japanese about the bombing while at the same time telling them that they could keep the emperor if they surrendered. Secretary of State James Burns, however, wanted to drop the bomb without any warning to shock Japan into surrendering. President Truman later wrote that he regarded the bomb as a military weapon and never had any doubts that it should be used. His advisors had warned him to expect massive casualties if the United States invaded Japan. Truman believed it was his duty as president to use every weapon available to save American lives. The source is American History textbook, American Vision, page 615. Okay. So we've read it once to read it. Interesting information. The next time we're going to read it, we are going to read and engage with the text. So we're going to highlight in orange or underline specific quotes, facts, images, information, etc. that support that Hiroshima's victimization narrative. So in other words, we're looking for information that proves that America was wrong to drop the atomic bomb. Okay. So as we're going through this the second time, I'm going to kind of pause periodically, and I'm gonna underline instead of highlight. I'm gonna underline things that say that America was wrong to drop the atomic bomb. So it says, even before the bomb was tested, American officials began to debate how to use it. So the fact right here that they're debating how to use it tells me, and I'm going to highlight that whole thing actually, tells me that there's obviously something to consider there, okay? Admiral William, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, opposed using the bomb because it killed civilians indiscriminately. So again, remember, we're thinking about why was America wrong to do this? So that would be probably one of those aspects. So we can say that our chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff opposed using it because it killed civilians. So underlining that. He believed that an economic blockade and conventional bombing would convince Japan to surrender. Secretary of War Henry Stimson wanted to warn the Japanese about the bomb while at the same time telling them that they could keep their emperor if they surrendered. Okay, so the Secretary of War himself wanted to warn the Japanese about the bomb. That's another huge point that's, again, pointing at America was wrong. Now remember, we're looking at this through these eyes. We're going to also look at it through the America was right lens as well here in a few minutes, okay? So Secretary of State James Burns, however, wanted to drop the bomb without any warning to shock Japan into surrendering. So maybe that shocking Japan into surrendering could kind of play in that as well. President Truman later wrote that he regarded the bomb as a military weapon and never had any doubts that it should be used. His advisors had warned him to expect massive casualties in the United States invaded Japan, if the United States invaded Japan. Truman believed it was his duty as president to use every weapon available to save American lives. So, maybe his advisors had warned him to expect massive casualties. It says if the United States invaded Japan, but so let's underline that little portion of that. Okay, so we've gone through and we've read the second time. The third time we read, we're going to come back to the third time at the end. But the third time you read, you're going to just skim over it. You've read it twice now. It's not a long text, so you should be familiar with it. And we can pull out those things that we underlined and kind of put those in our own words when you go to the graphic organizer. So if you go to slide 13, or if you're on the Word document, you scroll down to the graphic organizer that says the Japanese experience main points. This is where you're going to type in or write in your ideas. So remember, we're reviewing our annotations, and we're thinking about how America was wrong to drop the atomic bomb. So thinking about how the Japanese were a victim of this. Okay, so thinking of those 3 points that we've underlined, or 4 points, we can say that even American officials were debating how to use it. We could say something along the lines of how American officials opposed using the bomb because of how many people it would kill. We could say something about how American officials wanted to warn the Japanese and how they knew there would be massive casualties. So what you're going to do is you're going to continue with those documents. So if you go back to your slide 9, notice that you're looking at documents A through E. So you're going to do the same thing I just did for document A, and you're going to go ahead and do that for document B, document C, document D, and document E. So you're going to read through to read, you're going to read through to read one time, and then you're going to read and annotate, so underlining those things, and then you're going to read to, we'll skim basically to pull out those things that show that Japan, the Japanese experience, okay? So then we're gonna go ahead and scroll down to the next thing. So if you click on slide 14, you can see that your step 4 directions are using those same exact documents that we just used. Now we're going to look at the opposite side. So for this side, we've become familiar with the text. We're going to go back this time and we're going to look for the opposite ideas. We're going to read and highlight in green or bold the quotes, the facts, the images, the information that supports the Hiroshima as triumph narrative, or in other words, the look for information that proves that America was correct and right to drop the atomic bomb. The third text engagement, we're going to go back and do the same as we did with the other graphic organizer. So I'm going to go ahead and bold these this time. We're going to do the same thing. I'm going to start again in document A. Like I said, we've already read document A, so this time, remember, we're looking for that American experience, or America as being right in dropping the atomic bombs. So I'm going to bold the things that I see, okay? So it says, even before the bomb was tested, they began to debate. We had already underlined the Japanese aspects of it. So again, though, the fact that they're debating how to use it could go either way, right? It could also mean that some people saw a benefit in that, okay? Secretary of War, while at the same time telling them that they could keep their emperor if they surrendered. So this one kind of points to the fact that he is going to warn them about it, but also the fact that he is still going to use it. Like, he's warning them to say, get ready because we're about to use this because of what you're doing, okay? And then the Secretary of State, James Burns, however, wanted to drop the bomb without any warning to shock Japan, and that's obviously going to be a big argument for America. President Truman later wrote that he regarded the bomb as a military weapon and never had any doubts it should be used. That's huge. The president is saying right there that he is very for using it and that he didn't have any doubt that it should be used ever. And it says his advisors warned of massive casualties. Truman believed it was his duty as president to use every weapon available to save American lives. I feel like that's a really impactful statement. So he feels like it is on him as president to do everything he can to save American people. Okay, so we've gone through and bolded, and so now we're going to go back to our other graphic organizer, so you can find on slide 18, or you can scroll down in your Word document to where it says American Experience, main points, and we're going to do the same thing. So going back to those things that we bolded this time, and we're going to just put those in our own words. So how do those formulate the American experience? Okay, so taking those, the American officials, they're debating again how it should be used. Some wanted to warn Japan of the bomb, but they still wanted to use it. Some wanted to drop it without any warning for the shock factor. But I think the main thing in document A that really sticks out to me anyways is the president and his words, and the fact that he really felt like it was his duty as president to do whatever he could to save American lives. And so that's kind of where he was. So obviously you would go back then and you would do the same things for document B, C, D, and E, and then you would put your thoughts in your American experience main points, just like you did for your Japanese experience main points. Now, after all of that, you are going to look at step 5. Step 5 says, this is our debrief. And it's just after you have gotten a look at both sides, both views of this, you've really dived into all of this information, you're now going to take a minute to debrief on the topic. So in a short response format, thinking about these questions. Should the United States have dropped the bomb? Why is that a difficult question? Why is should the United States have dropped the bomb a difficult question? And then do we feel like we can judge Truman's decision? So President Truman, can we accurately judge his decision to drop these bombs, and why or why not? And then maybe what would we need to know to feel qualified to judge that those decisions of dropping that bomb? I hope you enjoyed it and you use these tools and resources really well. Super interesting things. Also, obviously, being so close to Oak Ridge, we've got tons of information on the atomic bomb, great resources out there. If you have any questions, you can contact me at Lindsey, Lindsey.Parks, Parks, @knoxschools.org. Thank you so much.